At Matthew 24:3, the disciples asked this question, right? Let's take a look. What will be the sign of your coming? There's the noun form, and the word that we're highlighting right now, Ron says, the Greek word for coming is parousia. And we've looked at this in the past. It means arrival and subsequent presence. Notice that Ron highlights that it's subsequent presence. We've already looked at the cultural background behind this word, how that it was used in ancient Greek to describe an important dignitary who would be announcing his arrival to a particular town in advance. Right, there's your sign, your advance warning. He would tell them that he's going to come so that the people, when the time came for him to approach the city, rather than being taken by surprise, the people would actually go out and meet the dignitary. There's even a second Greek word that also has this concept of going out and meeting the dignitary. But germane to our point is that along with the dignitary coming into town, being escorted back into town after the townspeople go out past the city limits to meet the dignitary and then escort him back into town, similar to the way that the people in the Gospels went out to meet Jesus on Palm Sunday and put palm branches on the road as he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. They were symbolizing they were using the custom of the day of going out to meet the important person and escort him back into town. Of course, they were escorting him to the cross, right? That's kind of tragic if you think about it, right? He was going to be escorted to his death. But nevertheless, the cultural setting is still there. Well, this word parousia is describing the coming, as in the noun event, but it's also the presence, meaning Jesus wasn't just going to show up, say hi to everybody, wave, take some photos, and then leave town very quickly. It wasn't like that. It was more like what we experienced during the presidential campaigns just recently. The presidential candidate would show up to town, then he would have a rally, he would have a speech, he would have a debate, he would go from place to place in that town, trying to push his perspective so that you would vote for him. So during the time while he was in town, we considered that as his coming in the Greek mindset, but it included a presence. He was there during that whole time. That's kind of what's going on. And so Ron's trying to say that this involves an extended period of time. That's why we call the second coming not something that just where Jesus drops down, hovers above earth, snatches us back up, and then disappears back into heaven, and we don't see him anymore. No, the day of the Lord activity demands that his presence is felt in a way by earth dwellers. Of course, we know that if we're talking about the day of the Lord, then that presence is a negative thing for those who don't know Yeshua, right? They're going to be feeling the pain of the trumpet judgments and the bowl judgments as they're poured out. But Ron goes on to say that it should be obvious that Jesus had previously taught the disciples about his parousia, for the nature of the question indicates that they're familiar with the term. Also, keep in mind that, again, Ron is combating the pre-trib idea that there is a separate rapture, different and distinct from the second coming. And that's why I moved away from the terminology that I had in older slides, where I was using this slide that you're seeing in front of you, but it was the blue version. And the red arrow on the left used to say second coming. Go back and watch any of my older videos, like 2 or 3 weeks old, and you'll see what I'm talking about. I used to have the rapture in red on the left, and then by comparison, on the right, I had the red arrow pointing down labeled second coming. And it just didn't sit right with me, even though I knew that they weren't two different events. I just didn't have my nomenclature lined up the way I wanted it. So when I encountered Ron Wallace's teachings, I really appreciate the fact that he helped me he didn't personally do it. Ron, if you're listening to this podcast or you somehow stumbled across this YouTube video, you didn't do it personally, brother. I just found your podcast and gave it a listen and really zeroed in. But help me to relabel the graphic that you're seeing in front of you to just call it the second coming, with a red rapture pointing up and a red Armageddon pointing down, but the whole thing highlighted is the second coming. So that's what Ron's working for us tonight. Let's keep going. So it seems to me, Ron says, that at those times when Jesus mentioned the coming of man, Notice he didn't have to say second because he's actually in front of them. And he already explained to them that he's leaving, right? John 14. I'm leaving and then I'm coming again. Well, if I'm here now and I'm going to come back, and the first time that I came is my first coming, well then logical deduction demands that the time I come back is the second one, right? The second coming, not a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth and things like that. We do not have to interpret all of the Day of the Lord activities, right? Like all the 7 seals, the trumpets and the bowls, if you include the seals as part of the Day of the Lord, which I don't, but we don't have to include those. We don't have to think of those all as comings, right? So like, let me go back over here and move down into like a slide that shows some of the activities of the seals. Notice we've still got the 7 years. This is not meant to be pinpoint precise because indeed, if I were to go farther down into my slides, you'll notice that beyond the 70th week of Daniel, beyond the 7 years, there's actually a 30-day and 45-day period, which totals 75 days that begin from the midpoint of the week that include activities. And in reality, I would place the Battle of Armageddon right about there. Right at between the 30 days and the 45 days, which means this final 30 days that I'm circling is actually the bowls themselves, according to my understanding of the end time events, which means the trumpet judgments are all played out somewhere here, something like that, all of this time period that I'm doing, which means all of this is kind of the Great Tribulation, something to that effect. So my point is that when I go backwards to this here, I don't want you to think that the first seal is an event that we should call the second coming. Rather, it is an event in the time frame that within the 7th week that will indicate some bad stuff happening on planet Earth, but we don't have to think of it as its own separate, isolated event, and thus there's like a coming of Christ that's associated with this first seal that we can call the first coming. In other words, taken to extreme, we'd have first coming, second coming, third coming, fourth coming, fifth coming, sixth coming, and then, now we have the trumpets, that's 7 more comings, and then we have the bowls, that's 7 more comings. So it can get ridiculous. Like I said, there could be at least 21, that's 7 times 3, and then the rapture itself is another one, that's 24, and then the Battle of Armageddon, that's 25, and then maybe we've got the salvation of Israel, that's 26, and we've got the marriage supper of the Lamb, that's 27, and you get the point. We don't have Jesus saying, okay guys, check it out. On my 14th coming, I'm going to do this. And then on the 23rd coming, I'm going to do, that's ridiculous. There's just one coming. There's just one coming, the second coming. It's going to include all these details, but there's only one coming. So it seems to me, Ron says that at those times when Jesus mentioned the coming, how many times? Once. The coming of the Son of Man. The disciples understood that he was talking about his parousia, his presence. So the umbrella term parousia seems to play that role of helping us understand that there's one of these events. Ron continues, and in the mind of the disciples, there was only one parousia, which they designate as your parousia in their question, right, at Matthew 24, verse 3. Let's continue. When Jesus answered their question, he in fact called it the parousia of the Son of Man, Matthew 24, 27, 37, and 39. And Ron highlights the meaning it's a singular. He's using the article there to highlight that. And in his answer, he equates erchomai and parousia at Matthew 24:30 with verses, for instance, 27, 37, and 39. And we looked at that last week as well. We took a lot of time to go through. You can do this on your own. Look up the Greek. Excuse me. Look up the Greek, and you'll find that there is overlap between Jesus' explanation of his coming, the parousia, the movement where he says, I am coming, meaning the noun, the verbal version, erchomai. We also have some other words, right? The paralambano, where Jesus takes us to himself. That event is to be equated with the rapture part of the parousia and the erchomai. And then eventually there are other words. I mean, Ron's going to get into some of these. I don't want to highlight all of them, but just flash some of them in front of you. There's the parousia of the Lord. There's the harpazo, which is the snatching away. There's only one of those per se. There's the episinago, the gathering together to assemble. There is from where we get our word synagogue. There's the paralambano. Then we also have the apantesis, the meeting. This word, I think, is the one that's similar. In fact, let me show you this real quick since I'm right here. At parousia, we have this idea in the cultural, let's see. Is this the one? Yeah. If you look at this, in the Greco-Roman world, parousia was often used to describe the visit of a king or dignitary to a city, which was a significant event marked by celebration and preparation. And when we take this word, parousia, and connect it to another word, which is apantesis, when we look at the usage and cultural background, it's known that in ancient Greek culture, apantesis was often used to describe the custom of what? Citizens going out to meet a visiting dignitary or important person as a sign of respect and then honor, and then they would accompany him back into the town. I think this is an important detail to take notice of, because in the post-trib model, they're quick to explain that. And I think John Piper brings this out. He's a post-tribber, as well as Professor Douglas Moo. I think he highlights this quite often. But this idea that we're going to go up, meet the Lord in the air, and then just float right back down to earth and accompany him down to earth so that we can usher in his millennial kingdom together as one bride and bridegroom who are a couple. And then we start populating the millennial kingdom with him. Well, in their model, in the post-trib model, the rapture becomes necessary because we need to preserve this cultural understanding of going out to meet him and then accompanying him back. Otherwise, it's kind of worthless to have us just go up into the air and then drop right back down to planet Earth again. In other words, from their perspective, notice that the ancient cultural custom doesn't have us going off to a different place, such as heaven, when the dignitary comes near to the place that he's visiting. So this is one of the reasons why the post-tribbers push back against any other model that suggests that after the rapture, what happens to Christians? We go up into heaven. Indeed, we pre-raptors do teach that after the rapture, we don't come right back down to earth. We do go back up into heaven. And the post-tribbers are going to say, how can you say that based on these two cultural words, parousia and apantesis? No, in the cultural understanding, we go out to meet Jesus, and then we accompany him back down to earth. You know what my answer is as a pre-raptor? You're absolutely right. We do go out to meet him, and we do accompany him back. But my challenge is, where does it say in the passage that we immediately come right back down? I do believe we're coming back down to earth. It's just we're not coming back right away. So when we go back over to, for instance, the pre-wrath rapture view, all I'm saying is we go up to meet the Lord, right? We meet him in the air, and then there's some stuff in heaven that does take place, some activity up there, but then we do eventually come back down to planet Earth to populate the Earth, or we could say to occupy the millennium, or like Kirchner purports, perhaps we come back down to Earth inside of the New Jerusalem as it descends to planet Earth, like we read about it at the very, very end of the book of Revelation, chapter like 21, 22, things like that. The New Jerusalem comes down out of heaven and descends on top of Earth and parks itself there. That could be the coming back down again. Either way, what you do not hear me saying as a pre-wrather is that we don't come back down to Earth someday. We don't spend all our time in heaven. Once we go up to heaven, we don't stay there. But I'm sorry, let me show you. So as far as parousia is concerned, yeah, we go up and then we come back down for the millennium. I don't have a problem with that. According to pre-wrath rapture, according to apantesis, what do? We go up to meet the Lord in the air and then we come back down. So notice I'm not denying the cultural aspect of going up and then coming back down. I'm simply saying, notice what happens in the middle between the going up and the coming down is this stuff in the middle, this God's wrath I'm circling. That's the thing that I think you post-tribbers are not accurately interpreting when it comes to Scripture. You're not giving yourself enough time for the day of the pre-wrath, the God's wrath to play itself out in the time frame needed to described by the book of Revelation. Thankfully, however, the post-trib pre-wrath are starting to get closer to that because they're putting rapture here, and then they're allowing for a day of the Lord activity before there's the coming back down. So, in other words, notice in the post-trib pre-wrath, we do go up, but we don't immediately come back down. Instead, there's time for the day of the Lord to run its course, and then we come back down here. In other words, we have to skip the day of the Lord activities there. So in their version, there's still this time frame between the initial upward movement and the other going down movement. It's that day of the Lord activity right there, stuff in the middle, that separates that. As opposed to above, we had a single going up, and I'm assuming a single coming back down, because the day of the Lord already ran its course earlier. So there's no need to hang her out floating up in the air. Instead, in this classic post-trib version, we go up and then we come straight back down, and there's nothing in the middle there. It's just one giant up-down movement. That's it. So, you guys catch that? All right, enough on that. Let's go back over to Ron Wallace. All right, so we got all these different terms. We've got another one, uchomai, which is related to, mainly related to the second coming, but the aspect that tells us that it requires a physical deliverance, because that's what this word implies, a physical rescue, moving from point A to point B. In other words, ruchomai is a word that helps us understand that when it comes to the danger that we're going to be facing during the day of the Lord, that everyone on planet Earth will be facing. If you're not a believer, you're stuck here. You're going to experience the brunt of the wrath of Satan and the wrath of God, both of them. There's no hope for you except that you trust in Christ during that time. But for those of us who are Christians, who are Christians now, Christians before that time happens, we can expect that the rapture is described as that rescue event, that delivering event that requires not just a sheltering in place, a protection through the event. No, this ruchomai word has a nuance of capturing the force of being used to describe a physical removal. That's why I brought it into my studies there. A tereo is the word that we would use to say protect through some hardship. So we have to balance these two out. But this is where we'd get the other side of the coin, to guard, to keep, to watch over while something bad is happening. I think that the balance comes from the fact that, I think the balance comes from the fact that if we look at the, if we look at the pre-wrath rapture, during the Great Tribulation, some of God's people will be supernaturally protected, but the majority of God's people will lose their lives. When it comes to Israel, Jesus already told Israel that you need to flee into the desert at the midpoint. The woman is going to have a place prepared for her in Revelation 20:12 to go into the desert for this final 3.5 years so that God can deal with her at the very end. But germane to my point is that at the midpoint of the week, when the Great Tribulation takes place, there will be many Israelites who are able to use this protection plan to escape the brunt of Antichrist's persecution. But not all, only the remnant. The majority of Israelites will lose their lives because they'll either give in, they won't take the mark, they'll refuse to take the mark, but they won't flee, or they're Christians already and they're just going to be persecuted. But nevertheless, we can have both the tereo, protection, as well as the rescue, because the rapture itself is the rescue, but at the same time, those who don't lose their lives but are not raptured yet, they can experience a measure of protection, or if you're Jewish, you can expect a measure of protection for the entire 1,260 days. So that's my point there. All right, let's really jump back over to Ron, because that's the main meat of why you guys are watching this YouTube video, right? There is only one second coming. That's what the title of this particular video teaching is. Ron continues, the second coming is both an arrival, the erchomai, right? This is why I keep highlighting some of the Greek. It is both an arrival and a period of time, a parousia. After Jesus arrives, he will then remain present in the vicinity of earth to carry out God's Day of the Lord agenda. I'm not exactly sure where Ron gets this idea. I haven't seen this articulated myself when he talks about remaining present in the vicinity of earth to carry out the Day of the Lord agenda. Does that mean he's on earth? Does it mean he's floating about in the air? I'm not exactly sure there. I'll have to flesh that part out later. But for now, just realize that he's talking about the day of the Lord is part of the parousia of Christ, meaning it's part of the presence, because it's the day of the Lord, and he is the Lord. Let's keep going. In Peter's second letter, he wrote about what he was taught. He equates the coming, the erchomai of the Lord at Matthew 16:27-28, which is, as well as 17:1-8, with the word parousia. Matthew used the word erchomai at Matthew 16:27-28. So again, we've got these overlapping of terms, and then we have some quotes now. For the Son of Man is going to come, erchomai, in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every person according to his deeds. And as well, we have another quote. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming, erchomai, in his kingdom. And then Peter used the word parousia. 2 Peter 1:16-18. Now we have our quote. For we did not follow sophistical stories when we made known to you the power and coming, parousia, of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. Notice that in all of these verses, what Ron Wallace is doing for us is he's helping us to see that the biblical narrative that we have preserved for us by the Holy Spirit lends a greater understanding to the idea that there's one event that is spoken of on which all of these passages are drawing their understanding from. Even though in one passage we might have, and we're going to kind of start moving into this eventually, we're going to see that even though in one passage we might have the initiation event being focused on, the larger event itself is still the second coming. So let's go back over to this slide. So we've got this second coming that is the primary single event that all of these verses are tied into, whether you're in Matthew's narratives or Paul's letters or Peter's letter or the book of Revelation. All of them are this second coming. But within each verse, sometimes the Holy Spirit will focus on the initiating event known as the rapture, and so we'll have details about the resurrection, the rapture, the signs associated with the associated with the rapture, when Jesus initially makes his approach to planet Earth. We've got the cloud writing language. We've got the angels accompanying him. We've got the trumpet language, the lightning flashings, the cosmic disturbances. All of these things are associated with the initiating event known as rapture. But remember, the rapture itself is still part of the single event known as second coming. And then at other passages, sometimes we see language when we're talking. Let me let that clear away for a second. We have second coming passage, but what Ron's going to highlight is that sometimes it's associated with either judgment, fire, Armageddon, destruction of God's enemies, severe punishment. Sometimes we have language like at the end of Matthew 25 that talks about separation of sheep and goat, or Matthew 13 where it talks about the separation of the wheat from the tares, things like that. Those activities are all naturally associated with the culminating part of the second coming that helps us understand that there's severe judgment that's associated with the second coming. So that's why I think it's important to notice that there's two simultaneous kind of, not simultaneous, but two important branches of detail that are related to this single second coming. And again, it's that we've got the initiation over on one side, but we've got the culmination on the other side. The initiating event known as rapture for believers primarily is a very positive event. It's a very joyous event. It's our blessed hope. It is that thing that we're looking forward to, that Jesus told us in Luke 21 to lift up our heads, for our redemption is drawing nigh. This is rapture language. This is that thing that is the brightness of the Lord's coming, that is positive for us. It's the taken part of the rapture. But with equal precision, talking about the second coming, the scriptures highlight that there's this very negative aspect, all of this stuff, right? I'm leaving out the rapture now. All of this negative stuff that's associated with the second coming, the judgment, the fire, the retribution, the punishment, the plagues, the darkness, the pain, the punishment, all of that stuff that's associated with the second coming, the fearful and dreadful part of the day of the Lord that the Old Testament describes, the eventual destruction of the Antichrist and the false prophet at the Battle of Armageddon, where this sword comes out of the Lord's mouth and he just slays his enemies, right? All of that is the second coming as well. And yet for Christians, we don't have to fear that. We don't have to think that we are appointed to any of that activity. So that's what Ron's going to be moving towards, in case you aren't catching it. We've got about 2 minutes left. We can read in one more paragraph. Ron Wallace says, Peter knows of only one second coming. We're talking about there is only one second coming. There's not a second coming known as the rapture, and then the third coming known as the second coming, which, as confusing as that would be in the pre-trib models anyway, right? Let me go back and show it to you. Let's jump out of that, go back up to here, and jump in here. In the pre-trib model, oops, we don't want to do that. We want to do that. In the pre-trib model, they've got the rapture, and then they've got the second coming. So notice the rapture is not the second coming according to the model. There's the pre-trib rapture, which is not called the second coming, and then there's the second coming proper. And that's just what they call it. Likewise, the mid-tribbers do something similar. They've got the mid-trib rapture, and then there's the second coming. They're two separate events, and they're not equated with one another. The classic post-tribbers, well, they just smash them both together. Sometimes I wonder, is it the rapture or is it the second coming? And they say yes. Right, the second coming is the rapture. The rapture is the second coming. We go up real quick and then we come right back down. So the rapture is the second coming. So I'm kind of teasing them, but in some sense they're right, because the rapture is connected to the second coming, but the second coming has an event called Armageddon, which is not the same as the rapture. So that's where I kind of pull away from the classic pre-trib view, is that rapture is part of second coming, Armageddon is part of second coming, but rapture is not Armageddon. Make sense? So that's using kind of Venn diagram logic, is there's an overlap when it comes to rapture and Armageddon in that they both belong to second coming. But there's a disconnect or disparity when it comes to rapture versus Armageddon because they're not the same event. That's the language and logic that I'm working from. So let's go back to Ron Wallace. Peter knows of only one second coming. He mentioned it again at 2 Peter 3:4 in the complaint from the mockers, quote, where is the promise of his coming? Notice it's a noun form. So this is probably the Greek word parousia. And then Peter directly related that one second coming to the term day of the Lord and day of God at verse 30, verse 3, chapter 3, verse 10 through 14. He clearly indicated that it is that one and only second coming that we believers should be looking for and be ready for. Look at verse 14. Right? Earlier we had, where's the promise of his coming? And then verse 14, therefore, beloved brethren, since you are looking for these things, be diligent to be found in him in the sphere of peace, spotless and blameless. I like that Ron points out that Peter connects coming of the Lord with day of the Lord. I listened to a recent pre-tribber in a debate against a post-tribber, and the pre-tribber was trying to convince the audience in this debate that the rapture is the blessed hope of Christ, as in day of Christ, and this is separate and distinct from the day of the Lord, which is the judgment of wicked people on planet Earth. And in theology, I agree with what he's saying. The rapture is for believers. the punishment on the day of the Lord is for those who have not yet made a choice that Jesus is Christ. Although when it comes to Israel, who's in that place of grace, although albeit not yet decided, they participate in the day of the Lord activities, but not in a judgmental fashion. At least not all of them. God protects a remnant of them and then eventually saves them at the very end. But germane to my point is that this pre-tribber was trying to make a big point of distinguishing the coming of the Lord from the day of the Lord. He was seeing them as, he's like, these are two separate events. And I'm like, well, maybe you might see that in Matthew, but here in Peter, no. And Paul does it too, I think. Peter and Paul both equate the coming of the Lord with the day of the Lord. So that's what Ron highlights as well. And then, let's see. I think that's a great place to stop. We can stop here with Peter's talking about the 1 single second coming. So we'll draw our study to a close. Just in summary form, what we're talking about, I think I'll leave off with this slide and park it here. What we're talking about is that there's 1 single second coming, and this 1 single second coming has an initiation event here known as rapture. That's the initiating event of the second coming. So it's the second coming, but it's the initiation of the second coming. And then after that, after the second coming has run its course, there is a culminating event here. And this culminating event is the Battle of Armageddon, which signals the end of Antichrist. And that's why I'm highlighting it on this chart, is because it's significant enough in biblical prophecy, end time events, to be the end of the enemy of God, the end of the enemy of the bride, the one who persecuted us, the one who took our heads, the one who took our lives, the one who mercilessly sent us off to slaughter and shed blood, so much blood that the souls under the altar in Revelation chapter 6 at the 5th seal cried out to God and said, "How long, O Lord, until you avenge our blood, until you do what is right? Get rid of this guy. When? Right? Suggesting that the tribulation is still raging on. When are you going to bring this thing to an end? And the Lord, Yahweh, God in heaven, the Father, he says, don't worry, just be patient. I'm going to take care of things. I'm paraphrasing. Obviously, he doesn't say it this way, but I'm going to take care of stuff. And I'm going to allow more of you to die, but when the time comes, I'm going to step in and intervene. And of course, that intervention is the initiating event known as rapture, which cuts short the tribulation, which was over here on the left side of the screen. The rapture is that initiating event that cuts short the great tribulation. And then God says, all right, Satan, you've had your turn. Now it's my turn. Right? You persecuted my people. Now it's time for me to persecute you and your people. And so God goes on the offensive and starts taking heads. You know what I'm saying? And so that's a good thing for us. It's a bad thing for Satan. But my point is that Ron's highlighting the fact that all of this is the single second coming. And we've got the initiation event known as rapture. Then we've got the culminating event known as Armageddon. But we're going to stop there. We'll pick this up next week. That'll do it for Eschatology, a biblical study of end time events.